my great pleasure to introduce Walter Johnson, who's the Winthrop Professor of History and Professor of African and African American Studies, and Director of the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University. Professor Johnson got his bachelor's degree at Amherst and his PhD at Princeton. Like Professor Ferguson, he's the author of numerous articles and books, 2 monographs, co-author of a 3rd, editor of a 4th, as well as numerous articles and book chapters. His 2 monographs, Soul by Soul and River of Dark Dreams, Slavery and Empire in the Cotton Kingdom, both won literally an awe-inspiring number of prestigious awards. I'll just name a few. The Francis B. Simpkins Award from the Southern Historical Association, the John Hope Franklin Prize from the American Studies Association, the Scheer Book Prize from the Society of Historians of the Early American Republic, and the Frederick Jackson Turner and Avery O. Craven Prizes from the Organization of American Historians. He's also been a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and fellowships from the American Philosophical Society, the Radcliffe Institute, and the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences. He's currently working on a book on the central role of St. Louis in the racial, capitalist, and imperialist history of the United States. And as before, we're going to be joined by 2 other fabulous scholars and colleagues who are going to comment on Professor Johnson's talk and some of his prior work. The first is Shirley E. Thompson. She's Associate Professor of American Studies and of African and African Diaspora Studies here at UT Austin. She received her AB in History from Harvard College and her Master's and PhD in History from Harvard University. Her first book, Exiles at Home, The Struggles to Become American in Creole New Orleans, is a cultural history of French-speaking free people of color in New Orleans over the middle decades of the 19th century. And the dissertation on which the book was based won the Ralph Henry Gabriel Dissertation Prize from the American Studies Association. She's currently working on a new project, a new book project entitled No More Auction Block for Me, African Americans and the Problem of Property. And finally, we have Vasuki Nesiah, Associate Professor of Practice at NYU Gallatin. She got her BA in Philosophy and Government at Cornell and her JD and SJD at Harvard Law School. Professor Nesiah's published widely on the history of politics and human rights, humanitarianism, international criminal law, international feminisms, and colonial legal history. Her recent book is an edited collection entitled A Global History of Bandung and Critical Traditions in International Law. She's also one of the founding members of Third World Approaches to International Law, or commonly referred to as TWAIL, and her current research is on reparations. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Walter Johnson.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure and a real honor. It's also a little bit of a fool's errand to follow James Ferguson. So I think the way that events are often organized is that there's a warm-up band and then a main act, and this is organized more like a book is organized, which is that there's a text and then there's a series of footnotes. This talk is not so much a talk about the foundations of a vision of justice, although some of the things that I have written about are that. But it's a talk that's about racial capitalism, and it's a talk which is an effort to think about a particular problem in the history of thinking about racial capitalism, which is the problem of expulsion and extraction. So to use the terms that Professor Ferguson just used, it's about the problem of African American precarity rather than the problem of the exploitation of African American labor. So in that sense, I see it as being at the juncture of the question of exploitation or work and extractive economies. It's about people turned into surplus, and in a way how it is that their presence is managed, how what is the material structure of the crucible of common sense that allows for the continued exclusion or erasure or separation or expulsion or even extermination of those who are so present both physically in a synchronic way, but also diachronically in their labor and in their history in the United States. I'm going to read. I want to begin with Thomas Jefferson's well-known passages on Negro inferiority in his Notes on the State of Virginia, published in 1787. Notes on the State of Virginia is the locus classicus of Jeffersonian racism. And indeed, the copy I have from the NYU library is marked by a set, you probably have been looking for it, but I stole it when I left NYU. The copy that I have from the NYU library is marked by a set of increasingly emphatic marginal comments. Racism. Racism with an exclamation point. Racism in capital letters with 2 stars. Racism in capital letter with 2 exclamation points and 1 star, as if some long ago reader had hoped to redeem American history from its sins by setting up a rating system for historical outrages. What is less well known is that Jefferson's published speculations about whether blackness resided in the, quote, reticular membrane or the scarf skin, the comparative sexual ardor of blacks and whites, and the poetry of Phyllis Wheatley came in the context of a discussion of a proposal to emancipate all of the slaves born in Virginia and deport them from the state. And what is still less well known than that is that Jefferson's deportation proposal, politely termed colonization in the historical literature, came in the midst of a larger discussion about revising the laws of the state of Virginia by liberalizing the land market, changing inheritance laws, and dividing the state into districts for the purpose of a cadastral survey, and using that survey to levy taxes for the support and construction of roads, bridges, and especially schools. Jefferson's racism, in Notes on the State of Virginia, that is to say, is of a very particular type. It emerged in the context of and was structured by his state building. It was an aspect of the project of reproducing his imagined Virginia, administratively rationalized, economically liberalized, and racially white over space and time. It dynamically interrelated notions of race, space, state building, and economy so as to render each of the key terms impossible of definition without reference to all of the others. It was an effort to align the imperatives of racial history, political history, and economic history by controlling the distribution of people over space. It was an elementary outline of a racial capitalist account of the future of the United States. And yet this passage is marginal to dominant understandings of both Jefferson and the history of the United States, hustled through on the way to a foreordained conclusion that Jefferson was a racist, congenitally tainted by slavery, the nation's origin. There are plenty of good reasons for this rush to judgment. Like many of the other paladins of American freedom, Jefferson was a slaveholder, a living exemplar of the American paradox, of the fact that for men like Jefferson, the freedom they so cherish and so poetically extolled was daily wrung from the bodies and souls of the people they owned. But there is more to the passage than that, because in Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson is not proposing that white people go on owning black people. He is proposing to get rid of black people entirely. Notes on the State of Virginia, I want to suggest, is a foundational text in the intellectual and social and economic and political and military history of a strain of white supremacy to which historians and social theorists have paid too little attention. a removalist, one might even say exterminationist strain of American anti-Blackness. I, like many others, have generally framed my histories of the 19th century in the terms provided by Patrick Wolfe in his singularly brilliant article entitled Land, Labor, and Difference, which appeared in the American Historical Review in 2001. There, Wolfe makes a distinction between the, quote, logic of elimination, which framed the settler colonial approach to Native Americans, and the, quote, logic of exploitation, which framed the slaveholding, if also settler colonial, approach to African Americans. At the heart of his argument is an insight about the history of gender and sexuality. The settler colonialist planters of the 19th century, Andrew Jackson, let's say, were exterminationist in relationship to Native Americans, even as they were pronatalist in relationship to their African American slaves. Wolfe makes it possible to imagine racial capitalism as a complicated and variable field of ideas and practices, where the expropriation of land and the extraction of labor framed wildly different approaches to the problem of racial violence and sexual dominance. But where does Jefferson fit in Wolfe's account? In 1831, Henry Clay foreshadowed the problematic later taken up by Wolfe in a proposal he made to the United States Congress. Clay, a congressman and then senator from Kentucky, who was Andrew Jackson's principal rival for the presidency in 1828, as well as being one of the primary architects of the series of so-called compromises over the issue of slavery that historians use to frame their narratives of the 19th century. I should just put in a footnote and apologize for the provincialism of this paper, which is about the history of the United States, and also to just give you guys a key to understanding the history of the United States, which is that when the word compromise comes up in the history of the United States, that means the white supremacists win. And, like Jefferson, Clay was a colonizationist, a charter member of the American Colonization Society, the quasi-governmental effort to send African Americans, quote, back to Africa. The American Colonization Society was founded in 1816 as an organization dedicated to exporting free people of color to Africa, where the society had funded and helped to establish the colony of Liberia. Over the course of the 1820s, however, it had become obvious to American colonizationists that any program of the magnitude that they imagined, effectively deporting hundreds of thousands, if not eventually millions of people, would depend upon federal support. And in 1833, Clay proposed an ambitious plan of federal support for the deportation of free people of color to Africa, which gained the assent of both houses of Congress, but was never signed into law by President Jackson. The idea was this. In the 1830s, the United States government presided over a massive budget surplus that was being produced by the sale of federal lands in the West. That surplus, of course, represented the expropriation and forcible removal of Native Americans. It was imperial and racial. Value gained through the forcible removal of non-white people and distributed to white men in the form of the property-predicated rights of full citizenship, racial capital. But because the mechanism for distributing this land was a market, it created what we might call racial surplus value, a vast sum of money available for federal spending. It was Clay's idea to use that money to pay for shipping black people to Africa. Clay's vision incorporated expropriated native land in the western United States, colonized tribal land on the west coast of Africa, a racially purified and rationalized United States national space into an overarching global vision of the political economy of race and labor. As in Jefferson, fee simple land tenure was to be the modality of white equality. Property rights and the land market were the mechanism that linked black colonization and white national purification. In the historiography of the 19th century, organized as it is around the question of sectional conflict over slavery between, quote, the North and the South, the American Colonization Society has generally been treated as a sort of untraveled via media that led to a historical dead end. This in spite of the fact that none other than Abraham Lincoln himself proposed compensated emancipation and colonization as the grounds for an armistice in his congressional message of December 1862, only months before he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. That's a pretty long historical fetch for a dead end. Indeed, it turns out that if we go back and look at the landmarks along the historiographical road to sectional division over slavery, they are quite a bit more complicated than their mobilization in the proleptic narrative of the coming of the Civil War would lead us to believe. They are indeed all characterized by an insistent strand of anti-black removalism, more often associated with settler colonialism, Native American genocide, and U.S. imperialism than with the history of U.S. slavery. As is well known, the question of Missouri statehood was the subject of a fierce debate in the United States Congress, one that raged widely across the philosophical and practical questions facing a nation that was at once pledged to freedom and mortgaged to slavery. Historians have generally treated the Missouri debate as an episode in the history of sectionalism, of the emergence of, quote, a geographical line coinciding with a marked principle, moral and political, once conceived and held up to the angry passions of man, as Jefferson wrote. In the admission of Missouri, he continued, the knell of the Union was sounded, a note that might temporarily be hushed by compromise, but could never be unstruck. Indeed, where it had been possible in the South before 1820 to be a qualified opponent of slavery, after the Missouri debates, no Virginian or Carolinian or still less Mississippian or Louisianan who valued their safety would speak out about abolishing slavery. The admission of Missouri, as the leading historian of the Compromise has written, called the South into being. But once the forces of compromise and union had mustered bare majorities in both houses of Congress, Missouri had been balanced with Maine, and a line at 36 degrees 30 minutes had been drawn westward to the Pacific and forward into perpetuity. Missouri was given permission to draft a state constitution. Missouri's first constitutional convention was held in the Mansion House Hotel in St. Louis. It lasted 38 days, and it produced a document that threatened to unravel the delicately balanced congressional compromise that had been almost a year in the making. For in addition to sanctioning slavery, the Missouri Constitution of 1820 directed the legislature of the new state to, quote, prevent free Negroes and mulattoes from coming to and settling in this state under any pretext whatsoever. This provision reflected the particular sort of Negrophobia that defined the non-slaveholding and working-class white population of the state of Missouri and the city of St. Louis. Migrants who had come to Missouri in the years after 1816 seeking land and economic advancement. Among them, many whose hopes had been diminished or dashed by the Depression of 1819. Angry, entitled, wounded white men whose own interests had an unsteady relationship to those of slaveholders. Men who might hold out hope of one day becoming slaveholders, but also men for whom the political preferment of slaveholders was an occasionally galling constraint on their own ambition and sense of racial entitlement. Many of these new migrants were from Virginia, where representation in the state legislature had, like representation in the U.S. Congress, been apportioned on the basis of population rather than suffrage, a marked advantage to slaveholders who lived in districts where there was a much larger number of people than there were voters. In Missouri, things would be different. Along with the provision forbidding the in-migration of free people of color, the Constitution of 1820 contained a provision apportioning representation in the Missouri House and Senate according to the census of the state's, quote, free white male inhabitants. Missouri, under the Constitution of 1820, was ruled by and for white men, not simply slaveholders. The cry has been raised, Missouri for white men, recalled the free black barber and chronicler of black life in St. Louis, Cyprian Clamorgan. This was the emergent ideology of the white republic. Throughout the antebellum period, the state of Missouri insistently curtailed the rights of free people of color. Under the 1835 revision of the statutes of Missouri, free people of color were required to obtain licenses in order to reside within the state. Those found unlicensed within the state might be auctioned as runaway slaves if they could not otherwise prove their freedom, or ordered to leave the state within 3 days. And in 1847, the state of Missouri reiterated the Constitution of 1820's commitment to states' rights and white supremacy. No Negro or mulatto shall, under any pretext, emigrate to this state from any other state or territory. After 1847, it was the legal duty of every justice of the peace, county clerk, and judge in Missouri to violate the United States Constitution by enforcing that law. In 1859, the Missouri State Legislature passed, although the governor never signed into law, what was termed the Free Negro Bill. The bill provided for the removal of free people of color from the state. Those who remained in Missouri would be enslaved and their property sold for the benefit of, quote, poor whites. If there is a single figure who epitomizes this long moment in the history of Missouri and the United States, it is Thomas Hart Benton, who represented Missouri in the United States Senate from 1821 to 1851, and briefly in the House after that. Benton's reputation in the West owed to his sponsorship of the graduation bill, the idea that the price of unsold federal land should be reduced by 25 cents a year until the entire public domain of the United States was privately owned. What could not be sold should be given away. The tenant has no country, no hearth, no domestic altar, no household god. The freeholder, on the contrary, is the natural supporter of free government. I say give it without price to those who are not able to pay. It brings a price above rubies, a race of virtuous and independent farmers, the true supporters of their country. So this is, I mean, there's a dialogue here around universal distribution and particularity of who's going to be a part of the distribution. It will now seem unsurprising that the most famous piece of pro-slavery jurisprudence in the history of the United States turns out, upon closer inspection, to be framed by a superintending logic of extermination and race war rather than simple economic exploitation. For Chief Justice Taney and the 6 other justices who concurred with his decision, the principal issue at stake in Scott versus Sanford was the question of whether Dred Scott had any right to sue in the first place. The Chief Justice's decision defined the right to seek redress in the federal courts as the sole prerogative of citizens of the United States. So this comes to the question of a citizen versus a denizen. He argued that the framers of the Constitution had never intended that, quote, the class of persons whose ancestors were Negroes of the African race and imported into this country and held in slavery could become entitled to all the rights and privileges and immunities guaranteed the citizens of the United States. Would the founders have been so stupid that they gave members of the, quote, African race exemption from the special laws that regulated their behavior? Would they have allowed them to travel from state to state without pass or passport, to go where they pleased at every hour of the day or at night without molestation? Would they have allowed them to hold meetings upon public affairs and to keep arms wherever they went? Of course not, he answered himself, for so doing would inevitably have endangered the peace and the safety of the state. Confusing black men, even if emancipated with citizens, was dangerous. It was but a step from that to war. The solution to the problem of democracy amidst diversity for Taney was not black citizenship, but black subjugation. Being of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, the Chief Justice wrote in the most notorious passage of his decision. Like the debate over the Missouri Constitution of 1820, Chief Justice Taney's decision hinged on Article 4, Section 2 of the United States Constitution and the question of the privileges and immunities of the citizens of the various states. For Taney, only the United States of America could make a person into a citizen. Whatever the rulers of any given state might to choose to do with those residing within their borders, they could not make them citizens, for they could not speak for the rulers of the other states in making such a determination. Thus, the Constitution would not allow any single state to, quote, embrace the Negro African, raise him to the rank of citizen, and immediately clothe him with all the privileges of a citizen in another state. So in a way, what we see here, I think, is something in relationship to what Lucy was saying about the way that different levels of law mediate presence into difference and even into, in this instance, absence. For Taney, the Negro stood exposed, the Negro is his words, stood exposed, naked, before the dominant race, and had no rights or privileges but such as those who held the power and the government might choose to grant him. Those who held the power and the government, he wrote, distinguishing between the two and marking out a space for the exercise of power even beyond law. Whatever protections blacks had resulted from acts of grace rather than from rights tested at law. The Scots, for example, gained their freedom only when an old owner bought and freed them of his own goodwill. As for their vulnerabilities, there was no suggested legal limit. For the black St. Louis barber James Thomas, whose white father and former owner concurred in the decision, he was on the Supreme Court, this was the rule of the white man's country made sovereign over the entire United States. That the Negro has no whites that a white man is bound to respect is shown by the mob going after the blacks and endeavoring to wipe them out, he wrote. It is no accident that so many of the examples I have used to illustrate the history of removalist and exterminationist anti-blackness are drawn from the history of the West, and particularly the history of St. Louis. St. Louis was the administrative center of the dispossession and removal of the native peoples of the Ohio Valley and Upper Midwest. It was the seat of the Superintendent of Indian Affairs until the 1830s, and most of the Indian wars fought by the United States of America in the years between the War of 1812 and the Civil War were staged out of Jefferson Barracks, which is in St. Louis, even to some extent the Seminole War, which was fought in Florida. It was, that is to say, an epicenter of the nexus of racial capitalism and U.S. imperialism before the Civil War. After the Civil War, the U.S. Army moved its forward operating bases further and further west, but the role of the history of St. Louis in Indian wars and imperialism was transformed, although not greatly diminished. Jefferson Barracks became the headquarters of the 1st Department of the West and then the Department of the Missouri, which included virtually all of the West anyway. And Jefferson Barracks was the base to which soldiers entering the cavalry, including the African-American soldiers enlisting in the 9th and 10th Cavalries, came to be trained. And St. Louis was the city from which they went west. This, in a way, there's a piece here that I'm not going to follow up, but as far as the way that people make claims for inclusion, one of those ways in African-American history is a sort of martial freedom. And Du Bois, among others, finds that to be profoundly tragic. And we can talk about that if you want. So African-American soldiers enlisted after the Civil War to fight Indian wars. The proximity to Indian removal and the emphasis on white resettlement on the West as a white man's country, I am arguing, produced a particular strain of American anti-blackness, one that was, like its anti-Indian analog, removalist and often exterminationist. one that was framed by a logic of race war and genocide rather than slavery and civilization. In his 1859 speech, The Destiny of the Races of the Continent, Missouri congressman and future Union Army general and confidant of the President of the United States, Frank Blair began with a vision of American commercial empire that linked the Atlantic to the east by way of a, quote, great national highway between the oceans. Blair found in Indian removal an example for the process by which blacks might be removed from the central commercial corridor at the heart of his vision of national and imperial greatness. The races of the continent could flourish only if separated from one another, each allotted to the climate that suited them best, their, quote, true zone of hemispheric habitation. Blacks in the tropics, white redeemers in the temporal central latitudes, and wild beasts and the wild tribes of men who pursue them, pressed out to the margins of white settlement and finally southward into Mexico. For Blair, the alternative to black expulsion, what he called the gradual transfer of 4 million of our freedmen to the vacant regions of Central and South America, was what would today be called white genocide. Black slaves would out-reproduce the working class whites until, quote, the wages of free labor would be so reduced as to destroy its existence. All who labor might soon be reduced to the condition of slavery. Neither black nor white, he warned in a pointed invocation of the language of the Dred Scott decision, will have rights which those holding power in the state are bound to respect. Blair's anti-blackness was removalist and exterminationist as well as capitalist and imperialist. It was framed by a fear of black reproduction and a fantasy of race war. It was this sort of anti-blackness which sought to spatially contain and expel black people that characterized the free soil backbone of the Republican Party that led the Union into civil war. This was a variant form of racial capitalism which treated both the expulsion of Native Americans and the exclusion of African Americans as explicitly analogical aspects of the same process that would enhance the prospects of white farmers by allowing them to buy cheap land in the West and the bargaining position of white laborers by allowing them the alternative of migration. And it is this vision which I think might provide an alternative, perhaps a specifically Western alternative, which is how Kelly Lytle Hernandez frames it, history of U.S. anti-blackness, one that places expulsion at the beginning of the story alongside enslavement. The historical sequence plantation, ghetto, prison might here be supplemented by the sequence colonization, expulsion, segregation, incarceration. And our focus on the exploitation of labor, so densely entwined with the categories of orthodox Marxism, might be supplemented by an emphasis on expulsion, expropriation, and extraction, on the ways of creating economic surplus and managing human surplus. Finally, the history of U.S. imperialism might be put into direct conversation with the history of U.S. anti-blackness, imperial violence with police violence, and infrastructural violence with economic violence. It is possible, without too much misrepresentation, to imagine the African-American history of 20th century St. Louis as a history of forced removals. The rail migration in flight from the South ending in East St. Louis and the neighborhood around Union Station, later known as Mill Creek Valley, where Scott Joplin, J.W. Blind Boone, Tom Turpin invented the ragtime that inspired W.C. Handy, and out of which grew modern jazz. The pogrom in East St. Louis in 1917, which destroyed the city's nascent black middle class, who had come from the South by the thousands to work in war industries and drove them across the river. The urban renewal and slum clearance of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, which turned Mill Creek Valley into what they call in St. Louis Hiroshima Flats. leveling the richly tessellated world of existential suffering and human flourishing chronicled by Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. The deliberate exclusion of displaced African Americans from the federally subsidized suburbs that grew along the outbound interstates built through their neighborhoods, and their subsequent confinement in the Pruitt-Igoe housing project. By 1960, the largest and most notorious housing project in the world. And then finally, the literal implosion of Pruitt-Igoe in 1972, and the dispersal of the black population of St. Louis northwards towards Ferguson and a precarious future. Each of these removals was associated with a characteristic form of extraction. So the point here is to think about expulsion as being economic, right? Not identical to labor exploitation, but also a mode of surplus extraction. Each of these removals was associated with a characteristic form of extraction. The removal from the South with the immigration profiteers and steamboat captains who left the exodusters marooned in St. Louis in 1879. The labor agents who recruited Southern blacks to work in the war industry of East St. Louis, and the resentful, entitled white workers who burned them out. The massive subsidy to white labor, especially in the building trades represented by urban renewal, public works projects that were consciously designed with the goal of forestalling white unemployment as the war industry employment declined after the Second World War. The massive subsidy to post-war white suburban development represented by FHA home loan guarantees, and the interstate highway system, as well as the intensification of wealth, homeownership, and racial segregation dating back to the beginning of the century. Furthered through all of the above, as well as decades of state-sponsored redlining and endemic discrimination in both the real estate market and private lending, and evident in the fact that today the St. Louis metropolitan area still ranks as one of the most segregated in the United States. So all of these are ways in which race was materialized and spatialized. As well as hosting the highest murder rate in the United States and the highest rate of police shooting in the United States. The murder rate in St. Louis is per capita 3 times what it is in Chicago. As well as boasting the highest murder rate in the United States and the highest rate of police shooting in the United States, the St. Louis Metro today is home to 2 of the 25 wealthiest suburbs in the United States. Which brings us finally to the characteristic forms of black dispossession and white accumulation that characterize our own times. The use of economically surplus black workers as human signifiers of blight to be converted into corporate welfare through revenue diverting bonds and TIF districts, into soldiers for the wars and prisoners diverted to the economic development of predominantly white rural Missouri communities like Potosi and surrounding Washington County, into revenue generating hosts for tautological North County municipalities. They exist to levy fines, and they levy fines in order to exist. It brings us to West Florissant Avenue, where the uprising in 2014 occurred against the backdrop of the edifice of Emerson Electric, a $24 billion a year corporation located in a municipality that was farming poor black motorists for revenue through its municipal court system. Or to the 4 buildings of Express Scripts complex that sit astride I-70 in Berkeley. Millions of dollars of property owned by the biggest corporation in Missouri, headed by the most richly paid man in Missouri, from which the Normandy School District and Normandy High School, the school attended by Michael Brown, the school where the graduating seniors serially donned a single graduation gown in order to have their picture taken at the end of the year, receives not a single dollar of property tax revenue from Express Scripts. But it brings us as well to the rich and purposeful, the resilient, resistant, and frequently radical history of Black St. Louis that runs alongside and interrupts the history of racial extraction, the history of what George Lipsitz calls the use values of neighborhoods. This is, I think, a politics that might resonate with the notion of presence. Those patterns of kinship and sociability, the daily ritual practice of Black St. Louis, have been insistently and violently subordinated to the exchange value of the land beneath their feet, as so many of, oh, this is from a different piece, as so many of these essays remind us, as my essay has just reminded us. And yet they have endured in St. Louis, endured to the point that shortly after Michael Brown died, before his body had even been removed from the street, there were dozens and then hundreds and then thousands ready to bear witness on Canfield Drive. Their preparation for that moment, their organization, their perseverance touched off a national movement. My own sense is that the roots of that movement run very deep in the history of St. Louis, back at least to Herschel Walker, the Black communist first active in the 1930s. Walker picketed Jefferson Bank in 1963 along with Percy Green, who became famous a year later when he climbed the St. Louis Arch to protest whites-only labor contracting, and then notorious when in 1972 he coordinated the infiltration of the Veiled Prophet Ball and the unmasking of the prophet. Green is the Percy Green of Green versus McDonnell Douglas, for those of you who are keeping score as far as law school goes. Green, who still lives in St. Louis, is married to Jamala Rogers, the founding director of the Organization for Black Struggle, one of the many organizations that helped coordinate the months-long demonstration in front of the Ferguson Police Department. What I'm want to draw attention to here is that you don't just get a months-long demonstration in front of the Ferguson Police Department. That reveals what turn out to be generations of organizing, right? Among the many young activists Green and Rogers have mentored over the years is Tef Poe, a co-founder of Hands Up United, who became famous in the fall of 2014 for saying, "This ain't your daddy's civil rights movement," when explaining the limits of nonviolent protest and the politics of respectability on national television. So you have a direct linkage from Herschel Walker to Percy Green to Jamala Rogers to Tef Poe. In Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson wrote rapturously about the natural bridge on his own land near Monticello, figuring it in the rhetorical forms of the sublime, as something so awesome that approaching it took him to the limits of his senses and the verge of rational apprehension. Looking down from this height about a minute gave me a violent headache. If the view from the top be painful and intolerable, that from below is delightful in an equal extreme. It is impossible for the emotions arising from the sublime to be felt beyond what they are here. In St. Louis, Natural Bridge Road marks the effective division between North St. Louis and North County. It runs between Fairgrounds Park, which was the site of Benton Barracks, where the Freedmen's Bureau consolidated black refugees and soldiers during the Civil War, and where, in 1941, the largest open-air swimming pool in the world was opened and then quickly and permanently closed after a couple of black children who wanted to swim touched off a white supremacist uprising. Natural Bridge Road runs from Fairgrounds Park to Lambert St. Louis Airport, which was built directly on top of Kinloch, a historically black city dating to the 1890s. The stretch in between is, by some measures, the most dangerous street in the United States of America. It also hosts the nation's highest concentration of payday lenders. This is the St. Louis Sublime. And yet, on the corner of Kings Highway and Natural Bridge Road, where the city meets the county, Tef Poe is starting a barber shop. Many of the frontline activists in St. Louis feel as if they have been abandoned. It was they who choked on the tear gas and faced down the tanks. It was they who touched off a moment of radical and youthful uprising that we see all around us today. But those who have come to be known for the work done on West Florissant are not from St. Louis, and they have moved on, leaving the city much the same as it ever was. It is Poe's hope that the barbershop will give them something small to show for it all. It was supposed to be on West Florissant in Ferguson, but the local manager for the out-of-state real estate holding company that owns much of the street where the uprising began in 2014 saw Poe's name on the application and refused to rent to him. And then, for a time, it was going to be on South Florissant Avenue in Ferguson, directly across from the police station. That deal fell through too. But from that terrific moment of possibility, the barbershop took its name. It is to be called the Frontline Barbershop. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies, wrote the St. Louis poet Maya Angelou in 1978. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise.
Let's move right to Shirley.
Thank you. I'd like to first thank Karen Engel and Dan Danielson for inviting me to participate in this event. I'm especially grateful to engage with the work of Walter Johnson, whose scholarship has been so transformative to the study of slavery and U.S. History more broadly. I should say, lest my comments seem like a bit of a non sequitur, I'm responding mainly to a version of the talk that focused more on the kind of interface between Native Americans and African Americans along the sort of logic of the West, logic of expulsion and extermination, and the Boston Review article on racial capitalism, the memorial article to Cedric Robinson. So I'd like to use my brief time to offer two comments or provocations from the field of Black studies. The first has to do with the relationship between Blackness and indigeneity, and anti-Blackness and anti-Indianness in the popular imagination and in the law and public policy of the United States. Blacks and Native Americans, or really Blackness and Indianness, have long been pitted against whiteness in similar yet distinctive ways. It's true that the Missourians administered Indian removal and orchestrated the erasure of a Black man's civil, political, and economic rights. But Virginians were also busy mapping the terrain in the terms of this racial juxtaposition. And I'm happy to hear that you start with Thomas Jefferson, because he's always my go-to guy as well, to kind of get at the kind of dark underbelly of this whole American project. But I'm not going to start with him. I'll start with Madison. In an 1826 letter to the Superintendent of Indian Affairs, James Madison spatializes this relationship between Native Americans and African Americans when he says, next to the case of the Black race within our bosom, that of the red race on our borders is the problem most baffling to our country. And of course, in Notes from the State of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson devotes long passages to addressing the conceptual, social, and political problems posed by the presence or projected absence, not just of the African race or the Black race, but also he has a passage where he's sort of thinking critically and nostalgically about Native Americans as well. Endlessly curious about the divergence of both of these groups from his own kind, Jefferson roots around in Indian burial mounds for skulls and femurs and fantasizes about scientific experiments which might render knowledge about Black intellectual capacities, if not Black bodies, by subjecting them to fire and solvents. So the racial othering and subjugation of Blacks and Indians is a tandem project of U.S. governance from the beginning, as well as a set of proposals for scientific experimentation. So extermination and removal of Native Americans indeed may serve as a kind of model for expelling free Blacks and freed slaves from the nation. There might be a kind of parallel logic at work there. But there's also an argument to be made that anti-Blackness is sui generis, of a different order entirely from the racial sensibilities that authorize the dispossession and removal of Native Americans. I'm thinking of the work of scholars commonly labeled as Afro-pessimists, who concern themselves with the unique ontology of the Black subject, following Frantz Fanon's assertion that far beyond having no rights that the white man is bound to respect, the Black man has, quote, no ontological resistance in the eyes of the white man. That's of a different order of non-seeing or non-recognition. Whereas indigenous persons had been grouped into recognizable and self-determined political communities, nations, domestic and dependent though they might have been, and had a respected claim to land to be dispossessed of, Black folks as slaves had, according to Frank Wilderson, no data for the categories of Enlightenment, sovereignty, or immigration discourses. The figure of the Black slave and Blackness as a badge of that status was disarticulated and disarticulating, an unspeakable scandal, comparable to no other. Even if you don't endorse the bleakness of Wilderson's diagnosis of the slave's peculiar ontology, I wondered how you might answer back to it, and to chart more precisely this nexus of Blackness and indigeneity, slavery and colonization within racial capitalism. Also, following again the problem as sketched out by Wilderson and others, if we trace out the political implications of this register of subjection, this predicament of social civil death, the only acceptable politics, that unthought but never forgotten specter waiting in the wings, as Wilderson calls it, is to wage an all-out civil war, meaning a war on civil society itself, aimed at a complete and revolutionary annihilation and transformation of the fundamental categories of knowledge and social existence. I don't necessarily subscribe to this assessment and this prescription, but its description of the predicament and its logic are not so easily discounted, this predicament of Blacks having no ontological resistance in the eyes of white, that there's no way for whites to even recognize the basis for claims to citizenship or even life that African Americans might make. So it's not so easily discounted. And so I wondered how your quest for an account of justice rooted in slavery, one framed in terms, and this is detailed in your Boston Review article, one framed in terms of restorative justice and reparations, might answer the charge that your framing of the limitations and deformations of Black subjectivity by slavery and Western thought, invested as it is in a kind of certain idea of man, may not go far enough. So that's one comment, that you might push up more against this Afro-pessimist set of claims, if only to hone your own account of how the Indian problem interfaces with the Negro problem, and what's to be gleaned from reading together the Black and Indian experience of exploitative, dispossessive, and/or exterminationist forms of racial capitalism. And just thinking, this is as an aside, just thinking about, you know, kind of your language or your category of exclusion, or focus on exclusionary, you know, sort of, you know, logics of racial capitalism. It occurs to me that plantation slavery already follows a kind of logic of expulsion and exclusion, in that Black slaves suffer the condition of social death. They're expelled from public and legal recognition, subsumed within the privacy, the private dominion of masters. In accounting terms, they're trapped within the balance sheet of the plantation, and don't have any, you know, sort of, you know, way of escaping that into some sort of legal or, you know, political personhood. The other part of my response pulls back from this Afro-pessimist hardline to take up your demand that, articulated most clearly in the Boston Review article, that we commit ourselves to asking about the experiences, ideas, and history of the enslaved, to investigating, as you quote Du Bois as saying, the philosophy of life and action which slavery bred in the souls of black folk. In the Boston Review piece, you outline the project before us, the project of, quote, using the history of slavery as a standpoint from which to rethink our notion of justice. I would suggest that this project demands a radical interdisciplinarity, or rather an undoing, or at least thorough interrogation of disciplinary methods and assumptions. And I can see you developing this in your discussion of the emergence of Black Lives Matter through these other, kind of flashpoints of organizing within St. Louis. In the aftermath of the lynching of Sam Hose in 1898, Du Bois, who was then on the faculty at Atlanta University, penned a careful and reasoned plea to end the threat of violence and to end the threat of violence in the community. And he set out to deliver this letter, this message, personally to his contacts at the newspaper. On his way there, he in this sort of famous kind of anecdote that Du Bois often talked about in interviews, he learned that Sam Hose's fingers and toes were already on display at a meat market. So rather than continue on his way past that display window, Du Bois turned around and resolved that, quote, knowledge wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to confront the libidinous violence of white supremacy. He turned instead to what he called propaganda, to exposing just what the Negro problem meant to the black folks who were suffering it. So this is the challenge, to develop a method of listening to and theorizing from this vantage point of those who are the target of and the object of this unspeakable brutality. Karl Marx knew that the commodity, luminous fetish that it was dripping with the violence of exploitation and thingification. But he couldn't dream of thinking about the world from the perspective of that commodity. He did entertain the question of what the commodity might say if it witnessed if it could speak, but he could only advance his question as a hypothetical. What if the commodity were to speak? That would be really wild. But he couldn't really flesh out what that wildness would sound like, right? The word he uses is grotesque, and then he backs away from the question. But some of the most provocative and productive work in Black studies has turned to this premise, the speaking commodity, as a real phenomenon, the register in which Black folks have issued testimony of their experience of racial capitalism, natal alienation, permanent and violent domination, and general dishonoring. What is the sound of the speaking commodity, they ask, and how do we develop the tools and methods for teasing out the logic of its thought and spiritual, intellectual, and political practice? On the subject of what this figure sounds like, writers and theorists have attempted to sort through and clarify the textures of moans and shrieks. For example, here's what Cornel West has to say in the deepest, darkest days of the Clinton administration. Quote, a central preoccupation of Black culture, West writes, is that of confronting candidly the ontological wounds, psychic scars, and existential bruises of Black people while fending off insanity and self-annihilation. This is why the urtext of Black culture is neither a word nor a book, not an architectural monument or a legal brief. Instead, it is a guttural cry and a wrenching moan, a cry not so much for help as for home, a moan less out of complaint than for recognition. Fred Moten, in a similar vein, formulates an aesthetics of the Black radical tradition that originates in the screams, the heart-rending shrieks of Frederick Douglass's Aunt Hester, however problematic and voyeuristic Douglass's own record of this sound happens to be. In any case, this pursuit for the slaves alternative visions of justice and freedom will have to confront the variously vocalized sounds of Black rage. And it will have to follow these sounds out into broader frameworks of critique and analysis. Douglas and Du Bois do this, of course, in their respective approaches to the spirituals. For another more contemporary example, we can turn to the late geographer Clyde Woods, who does a deep dive into the cultural, political, racial, and economic geography of the Mississippi Delta to discern the patterns of a blues epistemology, a critical and deeply cultural response to racial domination and capitalist extraction. Or to the late scholar of Black political thought, Richard Eiton, who surveys the deindustrialized post-civil rights urban landscape of the 1970s in search of what he refers to as the Black fantastic. And to Canadian lawyer and poet M. Norbese Phillip, who disassembles the legal records of the Zong case to imagine the terms on which the 132 African captives thrown overboard may have critically engaged their jettison. If this work is any indication, staying attuned to the various registers of the speaking commodity is an urgent but difficult task that requires an openness to innovative methodologies and a bold sidestepping of disciplinary strictures. It requires developing reading and listening practices that attend not only to the content of Black testimony as a source for our evidence, but to its formal and deep grammatical innovations as offering a potentially transformative critique of liberal notions of justice, of property, equality, freedom, humanity, and so on down the list.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks to both Dan's, but also Karen and David for convening us, and to Walter Johnson for giving us such a rich set of interventions in the two articles we read earlier, as well as in today's talk, which builds on and extends them. I should say in advance that my comments would have been truly brilliant if Professor Johnson hadn't stolen Jefferson's notes on the states of Virginia from the NYU library. But given that, I appreciated your work, Professor Johnson, in showing us how the story of racial capitalism can tell us, alongside the work that you cite of Lisa Lowe about the intimacy of four continents, to the vast distances between a few streets in St. Louis, the power of thinking the history of capitalism through slavery and colonization, exploitation and dispossession, through W.B. Du Bois and Cedric Robinson, situating white supremacy in expropriation and exploitation and the histories of expulsion. You show that these were not sequential, contingent, or supplementary to each other, but fundamentally imbricated. Indeed, that to think the history of capitalism is to think of the Atlantic slave trade and the appropriation of land from those who had inhabited it. These processes function differently and together to provide both the capital and labor of capitalism and neoliberalism, both in terms of a materialist account of the development of a bourgeoisie in the metropole, whose investments in liberal freedoms were intertwined with its investments in the triangular trade and the land and labor that fueled it. The investment in liberalism is also about the production of legitimacy and the production of the human, at once universal and differentiated, the promise of universality, itself predicated on the entrenchment of difference. Like capitalism, a flat earth of uneven development, in some situating race and its erasure at the center of the story of capital. This is very powerful and compelling, and at the end of the Boston Review article, you speak to the yield of this analysis and list 6 different dimensions. And my own reflections today are motivated partly, and I think perhaps with some resonance with Shirley's commentary and some of the discussion earlier, are motivated partly by thinking about number 3 in those 6 dimensions, the only one where you speak not only of what you call distributions of privilege and abjection, but also about pathways to historical redress and reparations. So I want to focus the rest of my remarks to this gesture to pathways of redress and reparations. And to do that, I want to first flag 2 notions of reparations and argue both against one and advocate for the other. So the first notion of reparations, and I think the most familiar notion of reparations, frames the rationale for reparations in the notion of repair, in particular repair through recognition of the weight of the past. Reparations are advocated for through the argument that history's victims need to be recompensed to repair old wounds and enable new futures. That is the unfinished business of reconstruction, of the decolonization process in sort of different iterations of this particular claim. In contrast to that, however, I want to argue for a different reading of reparations that foreground the disruptive rather than reparative function of reparations. I'm thinking of disruption here in the Rancierian approach to the political, what he sometimes calls interruption, a mode of acting put into practice by a specific kind of subject, he says, and deriving from a particular form of reason. It is a political relationship that allows one to think the possibility of political subjectivity. In this sense, the disruptive dimension of the reparations claim inheres in the interruption of received maps of political legibility. In this sense, there's a fundamental tension and a critique between the work of reparation claims in a disruptive register and reparations claims in a repair register. Indeed, one may say that reparations claims that are easily absorbed into our received vocabularies of the political are palliative rather than political. So this is a highly sort of truncated description that I've sort of developed more extensively elsewhere, but I don't want to develop it here. I just want to flag it to sort of, in some sense, register the rest of my remarks through the discussion of reparations as interruption rather than repair. And briefly reference in the next few minutes two different pathways to redress and reparations in the register of interruption. Seen thus, the reparations claim is not about temporally linear lines connecting past and present, yesterday's perpetrators and today's victims, but a critical mapping of the present that gets beyond narrow causal claims that misrepresent and distort the politics of power and distribution. In this light, reparations claims are not about progress that has been stymied and that can return to course with reparations, but a refusal of a redemptive investment in international law or history. They are claims better situated in what Fanon describes as a moment of occult instability that speak to the task and vision, legislative and affective, of inventing a future. So the two approaches to interruption as a way of thinking about reparations. I want to highlight sort of two resources for thinking interruption of racial capitalism, its structures and its symptoms. One that I will call fugitivity or immanent critique, and the other flight or external critique. And as an aside, perhaps I should say that I appreciated in both the works that was distributed to us that you begin by foregrounding your intellectual debts. And in that spirit, I want to also describe both of these approaches to interruption of the structures and symptoms of racial capitalism through my own intellectual debts. Debts to the Black radical tradition, but also shaped by other debts. In the case of fugitivity, sort of I'll highlight both Black radicalism, but also critical legal studies. And in the case of flight, I highlight both Black radicalism again, but also subaltern studies, third world feminism, and what we might call the spirit of Bandung. Fugitivity. Let me begin then with a brief gesture to what I mean by the fugitive. I take the term, of course, from Morton and Hani in the Undercommons to speak of how we may draw on the very social conditions shaped by racial capitalism for resources to disrupt it. Let me offer a very concrete example that draws on critical legal studies scholars and their approach to what Roberto Unger, following Keats, calls negative capability, or what Duncan Kennedy refers to as gaps, conflicts, and ambiguities for political disruption. The example I was thinking about was the case Johnson v. McIntosh that you referred to in the Boston Review article, a case, as you note, that is foundational to the appropriation of settler colonialism, namely mining the conditions of subjection. You mentioned Johnson v. McIntosh, where Chief Justice Marshall declares Johnson's property claim invalid because he brought it from Indians rather than a provenance traced back to settler colonial governance. And we routinely denounce his case as representing the racism and appropriation of colonialism that invalidates native title. And it is undoubtedly racist and unjust. But another critical legal scholar, Joseph Singer, cautions against whole-scale condemnation of that case. Seeing Justice v. McIntosh as having eviscerated native title can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. the dark irony that our very reading of Johnson v. McIntosh as having gutted native title can continue to reproduce colonial appropriation every time native property claims come up in a legal case. Instead, Singer argues that we should have a forward-looking reading of this case, attentive to the ongoing distributive significance of law and legal interpretation, including its force today, and rather than seeing it as a large-scale appropriation of native land, we should read the decision narrowly as simply invalidating commodification. These are important stakes, he argues, for Indian land claims today. In reading Marshall as limiting the encroachment on native title, instead of arguing that the other dimensions of property ownership survive the bar on commodification, and offer important precedent today in empowering native land claims in court. This may work sometimes and may fail at others, but that forward-looking approach to attend to the distributive significance of legal indeterminacy was also significant, I would argue, for the argument of Dred Scott. Not treating the Missouri Compromise as so damned by white supremacy that it was not worth the struggle, that Dred Scott's legal case was predicated on the notion that it was worth a try to get jurisdiction to be the patron of fugitive subversion, to make a claim for standing, to push against the odds for a long shot reading, that try to appropriate the Missouri Compromise rather than concede to its white supremacist logic. So it may fail, and there may other cases that may succeed, but it's a reading that I think resonates, or is an approach to thinking about reparations that I think resonates with what Moten and Harney describe as a certain tragic optimism, a fugitive impulse to steal from what they call the already existing, and here I'm quoting them, to point it out and to tell that truth, but also to see the other way, to see what it could be. The double sense, the double capacity to see what's right in front of you and to see through that to what's ahead of you. So this again is, I think, resonates with what Unger calls negative capability, and not the system redeeming approach to capability that we identify with Amartya Sen or Martha Nussbaum, but instead negative capability as connecting the dots between practices of freedom and undevelopment, or self-making, to use Saidiya Hartman's term. A fugitive effort to steal an interpretation. So let me move now to the second approach to interpretation, and this is what I call flight. If fugitivity or immanent critique is one path to interpretation, the other path, equally interesting, I think, is external critique, flight, dissonance, return, inspired by subaltern studies, Bandung, the Black radical tradition as well. I use the word flight because even during the Middle Passage, there was myth of flying back, which Greg Grandin, Toni Morrison, and others have spoken about, these myths of flight, of ghostly spaces of tragic utopianism, of finding alternative locations from which to think freedom and therefore to think freedom differently. Greg Grandin describes, for instance, an old legend where descendants of Georgia's coastal islands handed down a legend that captive Igbos would fling themselves into the Atlantic rather than submit to slavery, not committing suicide, but lying or walking on the water or dancing on the waves home. They did not kill themselves, Grandin says. They escaped by flying to their native land. This flight is both the imagination of human freedom and subversive of humanist promise. In a sense, this is an appropriation of what he spoke of today in terms of Clay's expulsion proposal through a subversion of the logics of racial capital, represented by a whole series of efforts to complicate the tragic utopias of return, from Du Bois going to Africa, to Ghana in particular, to Richard Wright traveling to Bandung, Malcolm to Mecca, or with different significance, of course, of Hollywood going to Wakanda. This may also be the mourn for home that West speaks of that Shirley invoked. And this is what I take from Pan-Africanism, from the symbolic significance of the reversal of the Middle Passage that Du Bois and others employed to make freedom a question. Or as evocatively captured in Nina Simone's work, I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. As Du Bois, Malcolm X, and others did before her, in 1974, Nina Simone pursues a question about what it would like to feel free by traveling to Africa. She went to Liberia thinking maybe it would feel like going home. And like Simone, Douglas even more famously poses freedom as a question, saying, what is a slave? It's the 4th of July. And I want to align this subversion of freedom, of liberal notions of freedom, as departures with the work, with an example from the work of third world feminism, thinking particularly of the fabulous Saba Mahmood, who we recently lost, whose work on the politics of piety in Egypt showed us that feminism may need to rethink received notions of agency, freedom, and self-actualization by taking seriously women's piety, In other words, by moving outside the liberal opposition between freedom and oppression, she provincializes liberal notions of freedom and agency that have been hegemonic in Western feminism to demonstrate that dominant feminism is but one approach to freedom and assumes a particular constellation of assumptions regarding rights, human subjectivity, individualism, and the political horizon of dissent. In ways that I think are simpatico with Saidiya Hartman, but also Pan-Africanism and the Bandung spirit, in excavating the plurality of ways in which freedom is inhabited and expanded, and the need for hegemonic feminism or liberalism to wrestle with the stranglehold of Eurocentrism and appreciate radically other approaches to political and ethical agency. This work is instructive, I believe, in thinking about the plurality of notions of freedom that jostle against each other if one is not tethered to the humanist investments of the dominant voice of abolitionism, which I think is what you were going, in the direction you were going to as well. And in other words, to relativize, parochialize liberal human rights and its promises. And in this vein, the Black Lives Matter manifesto, motivated by the killing of our mothers, Michael Brown, as you mentioned, on the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, that spoke not just to the freedom of black people, but also of Palestinians, foregrounding solidarity as central to the notion of Black Lives Matter. This counters the fatalism of social death by creating alternative geographies of political subjectivity, of self-making, to use Hartman's language again. So Asaba Mahmoud, Black Lives Matter, Du Bois, and the work of Saidiya Hartman show, I think, there are many ways of inhabiting the world that have vectored differently from liberal discourses of emancipation. And this is what I also connect with the utopias and dystopias embedded in the freedom struggles in the spirit of Bandung. The racial capitalism story of liberalism is a story of intimacy and distance, but also plurality, that there are many tributaries of globalization that intersected but also deviated, which had both converging and contradictory dynamics in small spaces like St. Louis and large spaces like different oceanic routes, and in some that much may be gained from a global history, but also from thinking of many globals. So in conclusion, I think I also want to go back to a reference to Frederick Douglass and Aunt Hester, and Saidiya Hartman, who begins her book by saying that she does not, that in recalling Douglass's recollection of Aunt Hester's beating, we are conscripted into participating in those scenes as witness and as voyeurs. And I've gestured to interruption as a way to refuse that conscription. Not a naive embrace, I hope, of resistance, but also arguing that we have stakes in seeing beyond the dystopic. That flight and fugitivity are not alternatives, rather they lie at a tangent at different parts of tragic utopianism. I invoke these notions in the sense that Moten and Hani describe their analytical terms in terms of their provisional, improvised, experimental use. Not the metaphor of the toolbox, but of the toy box, in that we may use and misuse them in ways that are intended and unintended. Johnson and McIntosh, Dred Scott, the Missouri Compromise. That is then, in conclusion, my working back to more explicit to talk about law and legal interventions, that even formal institutions and laws, even compromises, can be conscripted for play that was not in the instruction box that came with the tools.